Let's start out by talking about a couple of ideas that come up a lot in medical anthropology. The first one, and in many ways the most important, involves the distinction between disease and illness. You remember back when we were talking about gender, and we discussed the difference between sex and gender? We said that sex referred to a biological feature, the physical differences between male and female that were part of the basic genetic blueprint that characterizes human beings. There are a lot of features of sex that pose interesting questions for anthropologists, like why do we have the sort of sexual dimorphism that we do, and what might that tell us about human evolution? Now, those questions, though, as we said, are very different than the questions we would ask about gender, which is a cultural concept that's not reducible to the biological feature of sex. Cultures can think about gender in very different ways, defining it and conceptualizing it along lines that you wouldn't be able to predict just from knowing about biology. Now, we could say very much the same thing about disease and illness. In medical anthropology, disease refers to something biological, something out there in the world that can be scientifically identified and characterized. If bacteria have infected your lungs, that's a disease. If cancerous cells are damaging one of your organs, that's a disease. If the level of neurotransmitters in your brain has fallen out of alignment to the point where it's having significant effects on your mental function, that's a disease. Now, illness, by contrast, refers to the cultural understanding of a health problem. The same disease may be understood in different ways by different cultures. Right? The neurotransmitter imbalance might be understood by a middle-class American as a clinical depression. It might be experienced by a 19th century Victorian as a melancholy temperament. It might be understood by an Azande villager as a consequence of witchcraft, and it might be understood by a Gabusi horticulturalist as a reaction to the loss of bodily fluids. Those constructions of the symptoms are going to be much more important to the experience of the individual than anything about the underlying disease. In that sense, while disease is what affects the body, illness is what determines the experience of individual people who are sick. Now, having said that, I should also say that there isn't necessarily a clear correspondence between disease and illness. It's true that the same disease can be characterized as different illnesses in different cultures. It's also the case, though, that cultures can disagree about whether particular physical experiences constitute a disease at all. In the chapter we're reading for today, for example, there's a very good discussion of the different understandings of childbirth across cultures. Childbirth is, of course, a physical process that occurs in every society. Anywhere you have people, those people have presumably been born. And the process of giving birth is a key physical and social experience for women in every society. And everywhere it's got some common features. Human physiology makes having a child difficult. It's a painful and often dangerous experience for women. That's something that derives directly from the problems of having large-brained offspring in a species that walks upright. But is it a disease? In the United States, we certainly treat it as though it were, right? Everything about having a baby in the United States occurs through the medical system, a system designed and built to treat physical dysfunction. A woman who's going to have a baby goes into a hospital through the same admission procedures as one who's going to have her gallbladder removed. She gets put in the same kind of hospital room, wears the same humiliating clothing, and is separated in the same way from her family and her friends. The people who treat her are doctors and nurses, and while they are special ones, they're specialized in delivering babies. The way they dress, talk, interact with one another, and treat their subject is just like that of surgeons or internists. When she goes in to have a baby, the woman becomes a patient, a sick person, and everything that goes on in the birth is consistent with that. Now, you could contrast that with practices in Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula, where birth is understood among indigenous people as being a major challenge, but not a form of illness. Women have a lot to go through when they're having a baby, but they aren't sick. Accordingly, the people who help them do that are not doctors and nurses, but family members and midwives. The birth takes place not in the hospital, but at home, without machines or medications. In that sense, it's not just illness that differs from culture to culture, but really disease. The same physical process can be occurring in two places, but be considered pathological in one and non-pathological in the other. That's going to affect a variety of things about how those processes are treated. In the United States, for example, the process of birth is one that's treated very much like any other medical event, with extensive use of medication and monitoring and pain management. Most women who go through it receive medication for pain, often an epidural block, that makes it difficult or impossible to move during labor. In Holland, by contrast, pain medication is almost never used, not because giving birth isn't painful, but because the pain associated with it isn't seen as pathological. I remember having a conversation about this together with my wife when we were on our first field work in Denmark. I think I told you a while back that we spent a considerable amount of time with our first child in a hospital there. And while we were there, my wife was discussing childbirth with another mother who was there. And my wife asked what she had used for pain medication. The other woman gave us a funny look and said, "What pain medication? We didn't use pain medication." My wife said, but didn't it hurt?" And the little lady kept giving us this strange look, and he said, "Of course it hurt. I was having a baby," right? For her, hurting was just something that was associated with having a baby. Now, the way you think about the process, in other words, shapes whether you classify the symptoms as a disease to be cured or just a part of life that you go through. Now, these different attitudes toward and constructions of disease don't just differ among cultures, but also within them. All of us draw on a variety of cultural narratives when we think about our own experiences of illness. We might have the doctor tell us one thing that's based on a biological model of illness, and at the same time bear in mind folk remedies that we've heard from our grandparents, or alternative medicine techniques that we've read about in magazines, or maybe spiritual attitudes toward illness that we've gotten from our religious communities. We put all of these things together when we think about illness, producing something that's sometimes referred to as medical pluralism. Medical pluralism refers to the intersection between different models of healing that occur in complex or changing societies. One of the insights of medical anthropology in terms of medical practice is the importance of finding out about these different models. Arthur Kleinman has argued strongly for the use of illness narratives as a way of finding out about the ways that patients are thinking about their symptoms when doctors try to arrive at a diagnosis. Doctors shouldn't just ask patients, about where does that hurt and can they feel a tingling in this extremity or that extremity. They should also ask questions like, what do you call this problem? What's your word for it? What do you think caused it? Why do you think it started when it did? How do you think this illness works? Collecting this kind of information essentially turns doctors into ethnographers. And in doing so, it allows them to find out not just about the disease that the patient may be suffering from, but the culturally defined illness that he or she may be experiencing. Now, specialized terms like disease, illness, medical pluralism, illness narratives, these are important to understanding medical anthropology. Just the way that terms like polygyny and patrilineage are important to understanding about kinship. It's also important to recognize, though, that medical anthropology involves rethinking a lot of terms that aren't specific to the discipline at all. The more you look at different ideas about illness and disease, the more you find that the basic terms you take for granted when describing your physical self have to be looked at in complex ways. Your body, for example. When we talk about health and illness, our bodies are the basic unit we think of those happening within. But what is a body? Well, for us in American culture, it's something physical, right? It's a thing that is basically coextensive with your skin and everything inside of it. My body extends from about here to the floor, and from this fingertip to that fingertip, involving everything in between. If you were to look in a medical sense at any question about my body within Western medicine, that's the unit you'd be looking at, right? Now, that body is divided up into a bunch of organs and systems, all of which have complicated relationships with one another, but all of it is pretty much contained within this little unit that you see on your computer. Now, that's not the only way you can think about your body, though. For example, to what extent does the body include things that you can't see? The spirit that animates this body, is that part of it or something separate from it? Can we talk about my personality, my animation, the fact that I'm alive and looking at you as something that's separate from this physical body? Well, perhaps the answer is yes, they are separate. Those things are not really part of my body. But then, what are they? Where do they exist? And how does it happen that they are able to make this body do things like wave this hand, right? If we say that the spirit is separate from the body, then what exactly is it and how does it have an effect? If we say no, on the other hand, if we say that all those things are part of this body, then what are the contours of that? Where exactly does my spirit reside within my body? And is it bounded completely by this little envelope of skin? Is it possible that my spirit extends outward from my body, that's perhaps connected to the spirits of other people who aren't in physical connection with me? And if something goes wrong with that spirit, does it affect the other aspects of my body that are physically contained in here? Now, as you can imagine, cultures come up with very different answers to these questions, which means that saying exactly what the body is a very difficult thing to do. You can also ask about the nature of the connection between this body and other ones like it. In the United States, we tend to think of our bodies as very separate from those around us. I may love my parents or my children or my neighbors, but we are very much separate people. In a lot of East Asian cultures, by contrast, there's a concept that anthropologists sometimes refer to as the sociocentric self, in which the group that you're part of is a constitutive element of who you are. That group, normally the family, but sometimes a group like a company, is inseparable from the individual, and you can't meaningfully think of the body without including its connection to that larger whole. Actually, in a biological sense, that approach to understanding a body is considerably more scientifically accurate than ours. From an evolutionary point of view, organisms exist to pass on our genes, right? What matters about your body isn't whether it survives or not. In the long run, it won't. But whether it's successful in promoting your genes into the next generation. Now, one way to do that, of course, is to have children. But you could do it equally well by encouraging people who share your genes to have children. If one of your brothers or sisters has 2 children, that passes on your genes just as effectively as having one yourself, which means that your success as a biological organism is inseparably tied to that of your family. The sociocentric self, seen from that perspective, fits reality much more closely than the model of the rugged individual and your individual body that we find in American culture. The point, though, is that the contours of the body aren't just given in nature. They are something that is constructed by culture. And that's tied in with the ways that culture constructs everything else about the world. Who we think we are as bodies is connected to what we think the world around us is. And that's not just true of the contours of the body, but of how the body works. For most of us, the inner workings of our bodies aren't something that we know very well. You know you have a stomach, but where is it exactly? Where's the liver? Where's the heart? Most of us, if we were asked to draw these on a diagram, wouldn't really get too close to the real location. The stomach, for example, is actually about here, I think. But a majority of people describe it as being down in here. That's pretty common across cultures. I mean, how often do you really need to know the location of your internal organs accurately? But it's not just that everything differs in terms that people have different ideas about where things are. They have different ideas about how it all works. Right? Even for contemporary medical scientists who have access to functional MRI scans and molecular modeling and all kinds of high technology, there's a lot of disagreement about just how our physical systems work. For people without that technology, which includes most of humanity for most of human history, the scope for disagreement is a lot broader. Different models of how the body works have tended to follow different general theories about human nature, human society, and the nature of the physical world. One thing you'll find in a lot of cultures, for example, is what's sometimes called a humoral model of the body. In this model, the body contains a small number of different liquids called humors. The model most widely used in the West, originally developed by the Greek physician Hippocrates, postulated 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. In order for a person to be healthy, these 4 humors had to be balanced with one another. Now, it's possible, of course, for some people naturally to have a little more of one or another, and that could be all right. It would just result in their personality being shaped by the particular humor they had in excess. Someone who had too much phlegm, for example, would have a cool personality. Phlegm was a cool thing, and so you wouldn't have much emotional energy or strong reactions to things. In English, we still use the word phlegmatic to describe somebody like that. Likewise, someone with too much black bile, called melancholia in Greek, would have a tendency towards sadness or melancholy. And indeed, this theory was used to explain personality variations among whole population groups. The even-tempered Northern Europeans were seen as phlegmatic, while the fiery-tempered Southern Europeans were seen as having a higher level of blood and therefore a sanguine temperament. Now, in medical terms, Hippocrates and his followers believed that most illnesses stemmed from having these humors get out of balance. If you had a fever, you might have too much blood in you, which suggested that you needed some of it taken out. They did this at times surgically by puncturing a vein and bleeding the person, and at times biologically by applying leeches. If you had too much bile, vomiting might be induced, or purging through a strong laxative. You could also rectify the humors by feeding people specific diets that were believed to boost one or another of them. This model of medicine built on the idea of the body focused on humors that needed to be in balance. This model dominated Western medicine for more than 2,000 years, and it's still influential today. You'll still hear people say, starve a fever, feed a cold, reflecting a tradition of trying to use food to address the humoral imbalances associated with different illnesses. And if you look at ads for alternative medicines today, you'll still find that a lot of them are claiming to restore balance to the different essential elements within the human body. Now, I should stress that Hippocrates' model is not the only humoral model out there. The traditional Ayurvedic medical system of India, for example, postulated 5 basic elements that characterized the universe: ether, wind, water, earth, and fire. That makes up everything, including our bodies and the different foods we can eat. The body itself is dominated by 3 different humors in Ayurvedic medicine: wind, bile, and phlegm, as well as 7 basic components, which you could describe as blood, flesh, fat, bone marrow really, semen, and food juice. Balancing all of these is essential to health, and Ayurvedic medicine combined the use of special foods, heat and cold treatments, and various medications to treat diseases that they felt derived from imbalance. Other models include the balancing of yin and yang elements in traditional Chinese medicine and the balancing of hot and cold in much of Latin American folk medicine. And of course, there are alternatives to humoral models. There are a number of medical systems that propose maps of the body in which the spiritual energies of the body follow particular pathways and channels. Illnesses come about when those pathways are interrupted, and treatment focuses on opening them up again. Traditional acupuncture in China, for example, involves the placement of needles at key points where the flow of qi is thought to have been blocked in order to open it up and create a balance between yin and yang within the body. The Tantric tradition in Hinduism and Buddhism likewise envisions a set of chakras that channel life force within the human body, and it prescribes a variety of different exercises and medicines to promote the smooth flow of that force. Now, the point here is that different ideas about what the body is and how it works have powerful implications for the ways that people think about and try to cure disease. You could say similar things for other terms we tend to take for granted, like temperature, pain, age, hunger, and sex. Medical anthropology looks at all the different ways that these understandings of our physical selves are connected to the larger cultures within which people imagine them.